Good day, everybody. I hope that you are well and also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 5 English lesson on adjectives and adverb. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. We're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password. And then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 5. Once we've done that, then we're going to scroll down up until we get to our chapter of adjectives and adverbs. All right, so our chapter is adjectives and adverbs. Our subject is English language arts, grade 5. And the lessons that we are going to be focusing on is to choose between adjectives and adverb. And is the word an adjective or adverb? All right. So an adjective, right? We see an adjective, it tells us more about a noun. So it is a word that tells us about the noun. And adjectives, they often tell us what kind, or they will tell us how many. All right. So basically, an adjective is a word that tells us more about a noun. And adjectives, they often tell us what kind, or they will tell us how many. All right. And if we look at an example, all right, it says, the apples were delicious. The apples were delicious. All right. So we say that the apples were delicious. So, which means that we would then describe, or we will say more about the apple in the sense of it being delicious, right? So it's like asking ourselves, what kind of apples were they? They were delicious apples. So with an adjective, right, we see that an adjective, it tells us more about the noun. It's like saying basically it describes the noun, right? And a noun can be a person, an animal, a place, or a thing, right? All right. So we said with adjectives, they tell us what kind and they tell us how many. Adjective that tells us what kind, right? Let's say, for example, we were to describe a person or based on what a person has. So what kind can be described as in, okay, the person is wearing a red dress. So let us, how are we going to describe that person? We can say red as in for red dress. You can say long dress, short dress. You can mention the color, right? Those are all the things that you may do. And an adverb again is a word that tells us about a verb. Tells us about a verb, an adjective, or another adverb, right? And adverbs often tell how, when, and where. All right. So we said an adverb is a word that tells us about a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. Adverbs often tell us how, when, or where, right? And also when it comes to adverbs, right? Look at this example. It says Grace ran really quickly. So how did Grace run? So then we can say quickly. So quickly tells us how Grace ran. Most adverbs that tells us how, they end in ly. All right. So she arrives soon. She arrives soon. Soon, right, is the word that tells us when she'll arrive. So soon will tell us when she'll arrive. Soon, later, now, right? Those are all words for to tell us when. And then Fred has a friendly dog, and that is an adjective. Friendly is an adjective in that case Because remember, an adverb, it tells us more about the verb, an adjective, as well as an adverb. All right. So with adjectives also, right, and adverbs, they tell us how, they tell us when, and they also tell us where, right? How usually ends in ly, so it can be splendidly, can be hurriedly, right? But they will basically tell us how, and it ends in ly. Then also when, soon, those are words. Soon, now, later, and then also where. It's basically just asking where, right? All right. So once again, adjectives is a word that tells us about a noun. All right, let's go to aplusstudents.ca. Okay, so here we see an adjective, it tells us more about the noun. We can say it describes a noun, it modifies a noun, right? So it tells us what kind and it tells us how many, right? So when an adjective tells us what kind, then it can basically describe it in the sense of the color of it, the height, the weight, the length of something, right? Whereas with how many, it can either be a number, 5, 10, 2, 1, or it can be a. All right, so if we look at our sentence, right, we are now going to try and we're going to try and identify adjectives, right? Choose an adjective or an adverb, right? So in this case, we're going to choose the correct word that fits the sentence. It says the woman decorated a house beautifully yet expensively, right? So if we look at this sentence, we need to select the adverb within the sentence that tells us how she would decorate her house. And we can say it is beautifully. So, how does she decorate the house? She decorates it beautifully yet inexpensively. So, we will say beautifully yet inexpensively. All right, so Belle's collections of old jewelry was either lost or stolen during the move, right? So in this case, just off the bell, so just off the bell, we can say Belle's entire collection of old jewelry was either lost or it was stolen during the move. All right. Okay, we're going to the next one. It says the speaker answered the questions. Do we say reasonable or reasonably? And the audience nodded in agreement. So we need to say if the speaker announced it um, reasonable or reasonably. So we can then say the speaker answered questions reasonably. Reasonably. Right? So these are then both adjectives and adverbs. Right? And remember, an adverb, I'm not sure if I went over an adverb, but an adverb, it tells us more about a verb, an adjective, as well as another adverb, right? And adjectives, adverbs, they tell us how, when, and where, right? That is adverbs. Whereas adjectives, right, it tells us more about the noun, right? And adjectives, they tell us either how many or they can tell us what kind. Those are adjectives and the difference between adjectives and adverbs. All right. Let us do our test. All right. So we are now going to choose the correct word that fits in the sentence. So we're going to say Mr. Osborne. Do we say Mr. Osborne merely suggested you should proofread your emails before sending it? Or do we say Mr. Osborne mere suggested that you should proofread your emails before sending it? So Mr. Osborne merely or mere suggested that you should proofread your emails before sending it. Which one do you think is the correct word? All right, so if we were to choose the correct one, we can say Mr. Osborne merely suggested that you should proofread your emails before sending them. So merely suggested. When Beth saw Ronnie's puzzled expression, do we say she gently or gentle teased him about it? So when Beth saw Ronnie's puzzled expression, she gently teased him about it, or we can say she gentle teased him about it. Which one do you think is the correct word? All right. So we can say gently. Yes. So gently it is. So well done. Gently is correct. Okay, so tax increases will be discussed in a meeting open to, do we say the general public or open to the generally public? So tax increases will be discussed in a meeting open to the general public or generally public. Which one is correct? Is it general or generally? Yes. That is correct, because when we say tax increases will be discussed in a meeting open to, remember generally it's not, because general public is to do with the people, right? So we can say general public. So well done. General is correct. The speaker answered the question reasonably, or do we say the speaker answered the question reasonable and the audience nodded in agreement? We need to either choose one of that two. The speaker answered the question reasonably and the audience nodded in agreement, or do we say the speaker answered the question reasonable and the audience nodded in agreement? All right, so we can say the speaker answered the question reasonably, not reasonable, reasonably. And the audience nodded in agreement. Yes, so well done, well done. All right, the audience continued cheering as the, do we say the remarkable performers left the stage or remarkably performers left the stage? So the audience continued cheering as the remarkable performers left the stage or the remarkably performers left the stage. Which one is the correct one? Remarkable or remarkably? So remarkable or remarkably performance. All right. So if we say, we will say the audience continued cheering as the remarkable performance left the stage. Beautiful. Remember, remarkable is an adjective, and usually when we say remarkably, then it's an adverb, like basically like telling us more about the verb, right? So it's telling us more about the verb. All right. So now we're going to say, is the word an adjective or an adverb, right? So once again, an adjective is a word that tells us more about the noun, right? Adjectives, they often tell us what kind, or they will tell us how many. For example, the apple was delicious, right? So what kind of apple was it? It was a delicious apple, right? And an adjective that tells us what kind, it tells us about what kind of apple they were. So we mentioned it was a delicious apple. An adverb is a word that tells us about the verb, adjective, or another adverb. And adverbs they often tell us how, when, or where. All right. So it says an adjective. So an adverb, right, is a word that tells us about a verb. So adverb, right? There we have the word verb inside of that. So an adverb tells us more about the verb, it tells us about the adjective, or it tells us about another adverb, right? And it often tells us how, it tells us when, or it tells us where. And examples of adverbs are Grace ran really quickly. So quickly tells us how Grace ran, right? So quickly tells us how Grace ran. Most adverbs, they tell us how, and then it ends in ly, right? Like the adverb quickly. Quickly tells us how Grace ran, right? So quickly. You can't always use ly to tell whether a word is adjective or adverb. Like, for example, when will she arrive? Soon, right? Soon is also a word that will tell us when, for example, she will arrive. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to use the word ly and everything, but usually we use ly when we want to say how, when we mention how, the adverb how, basically. All right. So an adverb usually ends with ly. An adjective usually does not have an ly unless it's maybe a word like friendly. All right. If we look at this word, Alex was pleasantly surprised by the small gift we gave him. Pleasantly surprised. So the word pleasantly, is that an adjective or an adverb? Think of an adverb that tells us how. All right. And if we were to select if it's an adjective or it's an adverb, right? And then we will say pleasantly. Pleasantly is an adverb. It's an adverb, right? And remember, we said that with an adverb, it tells us how, and then it usually ends with an ly. The biology student examined the feathers closely. Closely. Is that an adjective or is that an adverb? Closely. All right, so we said closely is an adverb, right? An adverb. All right, the squirming child. This is not us telling us more about the child. So the squirming child struggled to escape her mother's grasp. The squirming child. This is not telling us more about the noun. So is this an adjective or is it an adverb? So the squirming child. So look at the word in bold. Squirming. Is this an adjective or is it an adverb? And if we were to say which one it is, then we can say the squirming child is an adjective, right? It's an adjective because it tells us more about the child. It tells us more about the noun. So it's an adjective, right? And before we go on to our test, right, an adjective is a word that tells us more about the noun, right? Adjectives, they often tell us what kind or how many. So an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun and it tells us what kind and how many, whereas an adverb, it tell us more about the verb and it will tell us more about the verb, an adjective or another adverb. And adverbs, they tell us how, when and where, and most times some of our adverbs will tell us when it tells us how, then it ends in ly, right? It ends in ly. That is not the adverb, right? Not always, but most times. Because some adverbs, like maybe if you ask where or when, and then it will end, like maybe they'll say soon or later or yesterday, but it doesn't necessarily end with an ly. All right, now let's go to our test. We're going to the test and we are going to now say, is the word in bold an adjective or an adverb? Please lock the door securely when you depart. So please lock the door securely when you depart. Securely is that an adjective or an adverb? Securely. Please lock the door securely. Is that an adjective or an adverb? So we can say it is, if you must say lock the door securely, then yes, we can say it's an adverb. All right, so the lemonade you made from scratch is so refreshing. So the lemonade you made from scratch is so refreshing. So refreshing, is an adjective or is it an adverb? Tells us about the lemonade that was made. All right, so the lemonade you made from scratch is so refreshing. And if we were to choose if it's an adjective or an adverb, right, then we would say refreshing is an adjective because it tells us more about the lemonade. It tells us what kind of lemonade it is, not what kind it is, but like how it really is. Volunteers generously constructed a new playground in Newport. All right, so volunteers, we would say generously constructed a new playground. So we would then say it is an adverb because generously, it's something that they did, right? How did they do it? They did it generously. Your final decision was quite reasonable. Your final decision was quite reasonable. Do you think this is an adjective or do you think it's an adverb? Reasonable. right. Okay. No problem. Let's go with the adjective. Let's see. That's correct. So an adjective is correct. I think what makes adjectives and adverbs confusing, right, is that it describes it describes a noun or describes a verb, right? But now with when it comes to adjectives, right? Remember, it's telling us more about the noun, right? It tells us more about the noun, whereas adverbs tells us either more about the verb or it tells us about an adjective or an adverb, right? Yes, so well done. Tori's bracelet has dozens of tiny charms. So tiny, right? What kind of charms? So tiny. Is this an adjective or an adverb? Tiny. An adjective or an adverb? All right, and if we were to select the correct answer, right, and then we would say it is adjectives, right, because it tells us more about the charms. It tells us what kind of charms. Annie was wrongly accused of cheating. Is this an adjective or an adverb? Wrongly. So Annie was wrongly accused. Is this an adjective or an adverb? All right. So if we were to choose the correct answer, right, then we would say that Annie was wrongly accused. All right. So well done. Well done. Let's do one more. Do people really eat raw fish in some restaurants? Raw fish. Does it tell us more about the fish? Is it an adjective or is it an adverb? What kind of fish? It's raw fish. So is that an adjective or an adverb? All right. So remember when we have an adjective, it either tells us how many or it tells us what kind. So in this case, what kind of fish? So we would say it is raw fish. So well done. All right, so that is now the end of our lesson on adjective and adverbs. We said an adjective, it tells us more about a noun. Pardon. Tells us more about the noun. It tells us what kind as well as how many. And then we have an adjective, an adverb. An adverb tells us more about the verb, adjective, or an adverb, right? And most of, or let's say some of our adverbs, they tell us how, when, and where. And usually when an adverb tells us how, then it ends in ly. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson. Thank you very much, Great Vibes, for joining the class, and I really hope you're going to have a good weekend further. Goodbye.